If you ever want to really understand what tough conditions, aridity, and barrenness look like, take a look up north and northwest in China, Inner Mongolia and Xinjiang. Stony, sandy deserts, semi-deserts, dry grasslands, and beyond that, there's pretty much nothing. A textbook case of land barely fit for life. Still, it's worth pointing out that many areas didn't become like this naturally, as endless development in China played a huge role. Agriculture, factories, uncontrolled grazing, all of it leads to desertification. And most importantly, this negative process shows no signs of stopping. Yes, the Chinese are fighting desertification by planting greenery. Many people have heard about this impressive effort. But China has another ace up its sleeve: horses. Not just any horses, but a species once declared extinct in the wild back in the last century. How are these rare horses and the fight against desertification connected? That's exactly what we're going to figure out today. Horses named after Nikolai Przewalski are the only surviving subspecies of wild horses that were never domesticated by humans. Unlike all the other hoofed animals we see in pastures and stables, these horses evolved on their own, keeping the traits of true wilderness: short, upright manes, strong legs, and a bold, cautious nature. They lived in the steppes of Central Asia, especially in parts of Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and northwestern China, where they adapted to life in a harsh climate with sharp temperature swings and scarce vegetation. But starting in the late 19th century, things began to go downhill fast for these animals. There were many reasons, and each one chipped away at the population's stability in its own way. The first and most obvious reason is hunting. Even though wild horse meat wasn't considered a delicacy during hard times, it was valued as a source of protein. This was especially true during droughts, conflicts, and famines in the steppe regions. Because they moved around in the open, herds were easy targets. Caution and skittishness didn't help. People kept getting more weapons, and horses had fewer chances. The next factor is displacement by livestock. As animal husbandry developed, the steppes where wild horses used to roam started to be actively settled. People brought in sheep, goats, and domestic horses. All this created competition for food. Livestock ate the same plants, trampled pastures, and spoiled watering holes. On top of that, there was also biological displacement. Domestic horses sometimes interbred with wild ones, affecting the purity of the population. These hybrids weren't fully adapted to survive in the wild. Alongside all this, their natural habitat was being destroyed. Agriculture kept pushing forward, bringing with it plowed fields, roads, canals, and fences. Where open steppes stretched just a couple of decades ago, now there were farms and enclosures. The migration routes of wild horses were cut off. Their familiar territories became out of reach. And since this species was adapted to a nomadic lifestyle and needed vast open spaces to survive, restricting their movement turned into a critical problem. It's important to point out climate change and desertification on their own. Asia's interior has always been vulnerable to land degradation, but in the 20th century, human actions made the situation worse. Massive shrub cutting, overgrazing, and depleted water sources all helped desertification spread faster. There were places where even the most resilient wild horses couldn't find enough food. The ecosystem started to break down, plants went first, then the herbivores, and after them, the predators. The horses just had nowhere left to go. On top of everything else, another problem cropped up: population fragmentation. Even when small groups of wild horses still survived in different areas, they were too isolated from each other. There was no gene flow between them, numbers kept dropping, and genetic diversity kept shrinking. That made each group vulnerable to disease, stress, and even random events like a harsh winter. One tough season and the whole group could be wiped out. By the mid-20th century, it was clear wild horses were disappearing. Even back then, scientists and just people who cared realized it was a problem. That's when the International Studbook of the Przewalski horse was created in 1959. It included all the pedigree and genetic information on the horses kept in captivity. The purpose of the document was to coordinate breeding programs and help maintain genetic diversity. However, that didn't save the wild populations. The last confirmed sightings date back to the late 1960s. Back then, scientists and conservationists tried to find at least some signs, hoofprints, tufts of hair, droppings, but had no luck. Przewalski's horses were officially declared extinct in the wild. All the remaining animals were in captivity. A few breeding lines of these horses were preserved in zoos, descended from the handful of individuals caught in the early 20th century. That's what kept scientists from closing the case for good. At the same time, something surprising came to light. Once these animals were gone, a lot started going wrong. Vegetation stopped growing back, dunes began to shift, predators started to vanish or move elsewhere, it turned out that Przewalski's horses weren't just around, they were doing important work for the ecosystem. That realization became a turning point. Different countries started making real efforts to bring back the horses that had gone extinct in the wild. It was the Chinese who put in the most effort here. Their western, northern, and northwestern lands used to be home to Przewalski's horses. At the same time, the named Chinese regions were huge barren areas where the ecosystems had degraded, and that's exactly where China kicked off the reintroduction of a species that had once vanished from the wild. The first steps to bring back the Przewalski's horse in China were taken right here. The place doesn't exactly look like it could support life, but it was in this endless dryness, sand, and rocks that the Xinjiang Wild Horse Breeding Center was founded in 1986 with Przewalski's horses as its main residence. Since there were no horses left in the wild, international cooperation kicked in. 8 stallions and 10 mares arrived from zoos in Germany, the UK, and the US. And it was with these horses that the official restoration program began in China. No, nobody just let them loose into the wild right away. It was only the beginning, a groundwork that, just like in zoos, was actually kept in captivity. Scientists conducted different research there, analyzed and predicted, making sure the restoration efforts were thorough and carefully planned. At the same time, the horses were breeding. Their numbers were growing. Of course, China didn't shy away from international cooperation in this matter because it was necessary. For that reason, for example, 18 more individuals arrived from zoos in the USA and Germany in 1987. Later, there were several more imports of foreign Przewalski's horses. All the horses were getting ready for their release into the wild. Acclimatization was in progress. They were housed in special large pens with conditions just like outside, though the researchers monitored everything inside the population closely. The horses learned to forage for food and find water independently, an essential skill for the local environment. The scientists also worked to develop the horses' abilities to steer clear of predators. Overall, it was a gradual process of getting the horses ready to go free. And so, starting in 2001, releases began into the Kalamali National Nature Reserve in the Yungar Basin, and they haven't stopped to this day. For example, in May 2024, the 18th batch of horses was released. During that, 7 stallions and 11 mares were sent back to the wild. That's 18 individuals in total. This release brought the total number of horses freed into Xinjiang up to 146. And already in that number, while not massive, they can still affect the ecosystems. Let's start with the most unpleasant thing for us, but probably the most helpful for the dying ecosystems of northern and northwestern China. Przewalski's horses produce manure. Before that, of course, they eat grass and other plants, and over the course of a day, the hoofed animals consume about 12 to 15 pounds. It's clear that the Przewalski's horse isn't a gourmet or an athlete, so along with the plants, it also swallows seeds. And from that moment, the future plants begin a real adventure. Having entered the horse in one place, after some time, the seeds end up somewhere completely different. For example, where there are certain issues with the vegetation, in the end, the seeds, along with the manure, fall onto infertile land and might eventually grow. Now imagine that the carriers for the seeds aren't just 1 or 2 horses. For starters, those same 146 individuals released into the wild by the Chinese, each one will spread seeds and help even the most dead areas get some kind of plant cover. Yes, of course, the seeds can end up in places that just don't have the nutrients plants need, which leads to a bleak outcome. The seeds don't sprout, they just die. However, Przewalski's horses have an answer to this. They don't eat anything harmful. Their diet is based solely on natural foods, so their manure is a great initial boost for plant growth. It's no coincidence that herbivore droppings are used by gardeners. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and other elements that come from the horse are essential for plants and their development, so even plants ending up in the harshest places have a good chance to survive. It's worth noting that horses spread plants not only because they eat them, they also simply walk, run, basically move around. Seeds can stick to their bodies and later fall off somewhere to grow. It's no coincidence that Przewalski's horses are called ecosystem engineers. When vegetation appears, animals follow. Invertebrates, rodents, birds, all of them gladly settle or temporarily use an area that's gained plants. It gets even better because after the trailblazers come those who feed on them. So thanks to this species of horses, the territories can really come alive. And that's not all. The impact of Przewalski's horses on biodiversity is way more significant. Take sheep, for example. They just trample in one spot and eat all the vegetation in a relatively small area, which can make the land unusable for anything. Actually, the consequences of sheep grazing are clear from the fact that, specifically because of them, Przewalski's horses lost their living areas. Unlike the cute, curly-haired wool carriers, wild Przewalski's horses graze, let's say, in a pretty specific way. In the wild, there are predators that these hoofed animals fear, so they don't stay in one place but rather gallop across vast territories. They eat a little bit here, a little there, and then back here again, and a bit more there. As a result, no area loses its plant cover completely. Moreover, for this reason, Przewalski's horses help create a patchy structure of the pastures. Simply put, that means the vegetation in a certain area is uneven. In one spot, there's tall grass, and right next to it, there's short grass. At the same time, the patchy structure of the pasture isn't just plants of different heights, but a habitat for a much larger number of species than a regular, even plant cover. For example, there are rodents that really need tall grass. There are animals that prefer short grass, and some benefit from both kinds of ecosystems. Overall, Przewalski's horses are able to turn the area into a hotspot of diversity. And yes, one important detail to point out, these horses don't yank the grass out like sheep. They bite it off, which for each plant means it regrows faster because the roots remain in the soil. In other words, even with many of them around, this species can't turn the place into something without plant cover. Unfortunately for the Przewalski's horses, not every individual is adult, healthy, and able to outrun any predator. There are young ones, or those who, for some reason, can't move fast enough to escape, say from wolves. Of course, right now, Przewalski's horse population in the Chinese steppes and semi-deserts isn't big enough to seriously attract a significant number of wolves. However, when this species, which once went extinct in the wild, expands its range, wolves will very likely come back to the area they once left. And wolves, well, they're also ecosystem engineers, and they attract other animals and help keep populations in check. So it's fair to assume that China's drylands will come back to life even more. All in all, Przewalski's horses, maybe not on a massive scale, but they really can help China deal with its current issue, desertification and ecosystem degradation. But for that, the Chinese need to boost their numbers. And in fact, the country is actively working on that. In Xinjiang, where there are both captive horses and a wild population in the Kalamali Reserve, the total number of animals has already reached 534. Not bad for a species that was almost wiped out in the last century. At the same time, China is well aware that building a stable overall population of horses means developing small groups separately. That's why major efforts to breed and prepare Przewalski's horses for release are also underway in Gansu province at a center in Wuwei. And of course, we have to mention that the Chinese are thoroughly studying this species that once went extinct in the wild, so reintroduction efforts can be more successful. And this isn't just beneficial for China, it also helps its neighbors, Mongolia and Kazakhstan. The Przewalski's horse used to roam freely in those countries, and now they too, along with China, are actively working on bringing it back. If there's any place where the return of wild horses could truly happen, it's Mongolia. This is a land of open steppe, where you can still ride all day without seeing a single fence. Back in the early 90s, the first Przewalski's horses were brought here, not from the wild, but from European zoos. The project kicked off in 1992, and one of its main hubs became Hustal National Park. It wasn't some local enthusiast who organized everything, but an international team, just like in China, including zoologists from the Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland, and the Czech Republic. The Prague Zoo played a major role and, by the way, is in charge of the international stud book we already talked about today. When the first animals had to be transported to Mongolia, they didn't hesitate to use military planes. Just to give you an idea of how seriously they take restoring and protecting the Przewalski's horse population. Over time, other areas were added to Hustai Park, Komental, and the strictly protected Great Gobi Reserve. Horses weren't just released here, full populations were established. And while in the 90s there were just a few dozen animals, now there are over 1,000. These groups live on their own with no feeders or enclosures. Basically, these are no longer projects. They've restored stretches of true wilderness. In Kazakhstan, the situation with steppes that are perfect for horses is similar, But the way the population is being restored is quite different. For instance, in 2003, 10 horses were brought to the Altyn-Emel National Park in the southeast of Kazakhstan. And by the end of 2015, the total number of horses in the entire country had only reached 14. As you can tell from the numbers, this kind of recovery is hardly large-scale. So in 2024, efforts started to ramp up. That's when the Return of the Wild Horses project kicked off. And this time, it's not just an idea, but a full-scale international program. The Prague Zoo is back in the game, now teaming up with the Association for the Conservation of Biodiversity in Kazakhstan, the Frankfurt Zoological Society, and zoos from Nuremberg and Berlin. First, in June 2024, the first group of 7 horses arrived. Then a year later, in 2025, another 7 followed. And just like in China, everything is carefully planned. First comes acclimatization, then research, and only after that, release into the wild. Doesn't sound like much? Well, Kazakhstan plans to reintroduce 40 to 45 horses into the steppe by 2029. Why exactly that number? Because it's the minimum needed to form a stable population that can survive without constant human help and still keep its genetic diversity. And they also released Przewalski's horses in a really unusual place, which underwent a major transformation in 1986 after the accident. This is the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone, or CEZ. Nobody was expecting Przewalski's horses in Chernobyl as old friends. They hadn't lived there before. But after the disaster, the exclusion zone turned into an experimental area where nature got the chance to live without humans. It was in these conditions, back in 1998, that they decided to release the first herd of 31 horses originally from the Askania Nova Reserve. A few years later, they added 5 more, not just for show, but to kickstart an important process. Przewalski's horses help keep the ecosystem balanced, something we talked about today, though in a slightly different context. They graze the grass and trample the land, which prevents it from overgrowing. The project was, to put it mildly, unconventional. Radioactive background, abandoned villages, predators, poachers, far from perfect conditions for a fresh start. But it's right here that Przewalski's horses not only survived, but also began to feel at home. At first, things didn't go smoothly. Mortality, diseases, human factor. But since the early 2000s, the population started to grow. In 2003, the Ukrainian side of the exclusion zone had 67 individuals, but by 2018, there were about 150. As of 2023, the total number of horses in the exclusion zone is estimated at 180 to 200, and some estimates say there are around 300 if you count both sides of the border. Today, Przewalski's horses in Chernobyl have become the unofficial symbol of nature's power to heal, and the animals have been acknowledged as ones capable of having a major effect even on ecosystems that aren't originally theirs.